Welcome, Mrs. Ghosh, in our show. My first question to you is that you have been making a case for increasing allocations to Manrega as well as increase in workdays there to 250. Also, you are arguing for putting in place a similar scheme for urban poor. But where will government find the fiscal space to fund these schemes?
I find it very interesting that whenever we talk about things that affect ordinary people, that improve the conditions of ordinary people, their lives, their livelihoods, we are asked, where is the money? On the other hand, when tax relief is given to corporates, which loses almost 2% of GDP in just 1 year, nobody asks, where is the money coming from? Because that's exactly the same thing. It is money being handed over to large corporations instead of to ordinary people. The difference in the kind of corporate tax cut that we saw and what we are advocating for significantly expanded employment programs is that the employment programs have very large multiplier effects. We know that the Indian economy is facing a massive problem of inadequate demand. We know that mass consumption is down. We know that even the large corporations are saying you have to do something to increase domestic demand. This is the best possible way. You are putting money in the hands of people who will spend it immediately. That will generate very large positive multiplier effects. At the moment, we have micro, small, and medium enterprises dying thousands by the day, are closing down or are facing major losses, are unable to survive. They employ 85% of our workers. We have to let them survive. One of the biggest ways of ensuring that they survive is by ensuring that there is demand for their products. And that comes from money in the hands of people down at the ground. This is the most effective macroeconomic way of stimulating domestic demand. And this is quite apart from all the issues of welfare, social protection, basic natural justice, the huge gaping problem of unemployment. These are, of course, issues that would be addressed to some extent by this measure. But there is the sheer macroeconomic impact of spending this money.
And you were saying that work days should be increased to 250, but currently
150 days, and I personally believe it should be 150 days per worker, not per household.
But even the current system of giving 100 days employment to a household, even average rate is 50 days only. So even the current mechanism is not met. So isn't it an ambitious call?
The reason it's not met is because the money is not supplied. In other words, the central government has been starving this program of funds in a way that it has absolutely no right to do. The law says that this is a demand-driven program, that the money has to be supplied if there is demand for work. We know that so many million households demanded work last year. Only less than 10% got 100 days of work. The rest of them, it's not that they didn't demand work, it's just that they were not given that opportunity. Because if the money doesn't come, state governments basically don't create that demand for work. They create it when they have a work program available. And that depends on whether or not they feel they have the money to pay for it. We have unpaid wages, we have state governments in deficit, desperately asking the center to release more funds, which have not been released. And so this is a program that is not delivering its promised 100 days because the government is choosing to starve it of the funds.
Similarly, you have also demanded that spend on health sector be raised 3 times. So to fund that, where should the government cut its spend on?
At the moment, the central government spends 0.3% of GDP on health. It's so embarrassing that I don't even dare say this abroad. People will laugh at us. Center and states together pay 1% of GDP on health. Again, globally, this is an abysmal number. Okay, the global average is more like 5 to 6% of GDP is spent by the public sector on health. So we should be spending 5 to 6 times more. In Asia, other countries are spending that much. When we say we want to triple the spending on health, What are we saying? We're saying that at the very minimal, to provide basic infrastructure, sufficient number of doctors and nurses per population, primary health centers, medicines, etc., the minimum you need for a minimally healthy population, you will need to spend at least 3% of GDP from the government. Now, 2% of GDP, yes, oh my God, it's so much money. Where will it come from? Why did nobody ask this question in 2019 when the government gave away 2% of GDP to large corporates? Why did you not ask that question to the corporates, saying that you're taking all this money? Where is that going to come from? How come suddenly that money appears out of a hat? Where it is things that are essential for the survival of our population, for the well-being of our people, for the future strength of the economy. We somehow think, oh, no, we have to generate enough money for this. But if you ask me, where will the money come from? I would say easy. One of the obvious ways to do this today is a wealth tax. This is something that is being talked about globally, all right? And we know that wealth inequality in India is not just one of the highest in the world, but has increased most rapidly in the latest pandemic period. We have got, I think, double the number of dollar billionaires that we had before the pandemic, while 99% of the population is worse off. So I'm saying put a tax on extreme wealth, not regular wealth. By the way, all of us pay wealth tax already without realizing it. Property tax is a wealth tax. Property tax hits everybody, middle class, upper middle class, everybody onwards. A wealth tax which is focused on the extreme wealthy, and pick only the wealth you can identify, financial assets, stock market holding. It's easy. You can identify a lot of wealth now. Just tax 4% of that. It's a tiny amount, nobody will notice it. When you are a dollar billionaire, you really don't notice if that wealth is taxed at 4% or 2% or 5%. You really don't notice it. If you taxed, a friend of mine did a calculation, S. Subramaniam of the Madras Institute of Development Studies. Before the pandemic, he did a calculation that if you tax just the 965 top wealthy families, 4%, you would generate slightly more than 1% of GDP. Just 965 families, 4%, which they will not notice, I promise you. Since then, their wealth has tripled. Since then. So supposing we even say we won't even tax them at 4%, we'll just tax them at 2%. You would still generate more than 1% of GDP. You could easily double your health spending.
But wealth tax was abolished by a former finance minister, Arun Jaitley, primarily because transaction cost was much higher than the collections. Do you foresee similar kind of troubles for wealth tax now?
That
also?
Wealth tax was poorly designed and badly implemented. It extended to all levels of wealth. It really went from the middle class upwards. It meant immense calculations and therefore naturally very, very high transaction costs. I'm not proposing that. I'm saying we go for the extreme wealthy. We go for 1,000 families, 2,000, maybe 10,000 families, okay? And we look at the wealth that can be easily identified. So we look at financial wealth, we look at property. That's it. And tax that. That does not involve high transaction costs. That only needs political will.
And you talked about income inequalities. Various commentaries, including yours, have talked about K-shaped recovery post-pandemic in India. To reduce inequalities, what besides wealth tax will you suggest to the finance minister?
Well, wealth taxes and other similar income taxes, all of this comes under, if you like, redistribution. But more and more people in the world have been arguing for pre-distribution. That is, look at what happens when the original incomes come out. And I think that's where we really need to focus a lot of our attention. Because currently what has happened is that we've had such significant deregulation in certain industries and in certain activities. And we have so many loopholes in existing laws and regulatory structures and tax regimes that it's very easy for wealthy individuals and large corporations to get away with paying almost no tax. I am sure I pay a much higher rate of taxation in India. Probably the informal workers, the domestic workers who work in my home, pay a higher rate of indirect taxation. then some of the largest corporations that get away with almost zero tax, and some of the high net worth individuals who also can shift their money around. So we need to fix that. We need to fix a world in which market monopolies can be created through things like intellectual property rights, control over certain kinds of licenses, access to preferential treatment by the government for particular policies. All of this gives rents, monopoly rents. We need to control those. We need to bring in regulations that don't allow excessive profiteering on the basis of human disasters, as is happening in the pandemic, with big pharma companies raking in billions, literally, while people die. So these are all aspects of pre-distribution, which is really about the regulatory structure. We've now had 4 decades of progressive deregulation globally, and we've seen what it has done. It has hollowed out the states and public sector's ability to deliver to citizens. It has denied ordinary people their basic needs. And it has enriched and made hugely powerful a very, very small elite. The difficulty with that is that if you create such economic inequality, that then creates a political inequality. They have so much more lobbying power. They can influence government policies. So we are in a terrible downward spiral, which we can control if we can generate enough political mobilization about it.
But you must be having some number on the fiscal deficit front, that how far can the government stretch it? Currently, even in this current financial year, it is budgeted at projected at 6.8% of GDP. The center's fiscal deficit. Where do you think the government could stretch it to fund all these programs? You said,
so, once again, I go back to this issue. It's also a question of where you tax and whom you tax. So we take it for granted that this massive tax rebate that was given to corporations, even though it didn't deliver higher investment, was something that was inevitable, and now it's gone and it's over, and we just assume that that is how it will be. Why? Why can we not tax corporations? Why can't we tax multinationals at the same rate that domestic companies are taxed? Why can't we demand that high net worth individuals actually reveal their wealth and we tax it wherever they are, just like the US is taxing the wealth of US citizens wherever they are? So there are many things we could do in terms of making sure that the rich pay their fair share. I'm not saying more, just their fair share of taxes. We are not choosing to do that. And instead, we're saying, find another means of raising revenue. Don't look at the rich. Don't look at large corporations. Don't look at market control. Look only at how we can extract more from the poor. I think it is possible to actually have a progressive tax policy that would generate much, much more revenue. And in fact, there have been calculations. I mentioned the wealth tax, but there are calculations on what we would get if we actually did a unitary taxation of multinational corporations that made them pay the same rate that domestic companies will pay.
What does it mean? Because domestic companies in India are now taxed at 22%, 25%, and foreign companies are taxed at higher amount.
No, what is happening really is that, you see, foreign companies, a multinational company can move its profits around the world. It can do what the OECD calls base erosion and profit shifting. So it can pretend that, okay, and my sales in India are so much, but my profits are very low because I have to pay all these royalties to my subsidiary in Holland or Ireland or Luxembourg or some other tax haven. And this is really what's happening with all the big multinational companies, especially the digital companies, but also others. They say, well, okay, Facebook, India, maybe my revenues in India are 12% of my total revenues, but I get only 1% of my profits from India. Because, there's all these other costs that I have to pay to my subsidiary in Ireland for intellectual property, for patents, for this, for that. I have to pay. I have borrowed from my company in the Netherlands and I have to pay them interest. So they shift around the profits to low tax jurisdictions. Now, the way to stop this is to basically say, I am going to treat this multinational company as one company. I won't say this is Apple India, Apple France, Apple Ireland, Apple Mexico. I will say it's Apple. And I will say India has this share of Apple sales and this share of Apple's employment, let's say. And I'm going to tax Apple on the basis of that share. So I will apply to Apple the same 24% rate that I'm applying to my domestic companies, but I will apply it on my share of your global profits. Okay. This would remove the incentive they have to shift profits around. And this is the subject of a major international discussion at the OECD, in which we almost had a victory, but the companies moved in and lobbied with governments to water it down to such an extent that it really amounts to nothing.
So do you mean to say that Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are now much watered down and will not...
Completely watered down. So the idea that you will treat the company as unitary, instead of saying, I'm going to look at all of, let's say, Apple or Google or whichever, Amazon, as one global company, you're saying, I will look only at the excess profits of Amazon. That is excess what? Above 10%. And then I will look at 30% of that excess profit. And then I will see whether I can apply any taxes on that. Ridiculous. Since when have any income taxes been raised on a notion of an excess? In India, are we saying we're going to tax you only on profits above 10%? We don't say that. So why are we suddenly using this criterion for multinational corporations?
And ma'am, what will you, Mrs. Ghosh, what will you say to apprehensions that already the direct tax is progressive in nature, and rich class, or at least super rich, is taxed, if surcharges are also included, at around 40%. So if these are increased any further, there will be shifting away of wealth creators from India to other countries. What will you say to this?
Let me put it this way. There is already, and we know this from Panama Papers, Paradox paper, you name it, we have so much information now about how much rich individuals and rich companies are shifting money out of the country. And this doesn't really have to do with the high tax rate, because it's always better to pay zero tax than even a minor tax, right? So as long as they can shift, they will. So the issue is not that, oh, if we raise the tax, they will move out. The issue is we know they are already moving out. How do we stop them doing that? And the way to do that is to actually sign global agreements where you say we will share information. We will tell you who has bank accounts here. We will tell you how much they're holding. We will tell you which companies they own. We will demand to know the beneficial owner of every single asset in our country. And we will draw up national asset registers. So some countries are already doing that. Scotland has done that. The United Kingdom is planning to do that. We are getting more and more efforts. Norway has done that towards building a national asset register. The Indian government has not gone anywhere near that so far. They're not even trying to do that, but it can be done. If you do that, then you can think of doing something like the United States is doing, saying, look, you are, for our purposes, an Indian citizen. We're going to tax your income globally. So if you are making income in Luxembourg, we will subtract whatever tax you're paying there, and we will tax you on the remainder. If the United States can do it, if other countries can do it, why can we not do this? It's a question of political will.
Ma'am, when the current year's budget was presented, few days before that, you had said that the two numbers are very important in that budget, and these are expenditure, government expenditure in the previous year and government expenditure in the current financial year. Now we are 9 months have passed. What is your assessment on this front?
Utterly, utterly depressing, unfortunately. We now know, because the government has to submit a half-yearly report to the IMF, we now know that the government in 2021 spent less. The central government of India spent less in the pandemic year than the year before. We must be possibly the only country in the world that has done that, spent less in a pandemic year. Of course, the implications for the well-being of the Indian population, I don't have to tell you. They are extraordinary. We cut down on so many essential areas, education, ICDS, I mean, fundamental things for our future. The nutrition and learning of children, we cut down on all of those kinds of spending. We increased on the home ministry, big increases in home ministry spending. Yet we cut down. And then in the first half of this current financial year, the government has submitted a report saying that it's barely increased. Even over that decline of the previous year, we have a very, very marginal increase in central government spending. This is appalling. Let me bring you back to the multiplier question. What does it mean? We know that mass consumption is down. We know that livelihoods have collapsed. Unemployment is rampant. People don't have money to buy food, forget about other things. And therefore, mass consumption demand is down. Because of that, private investors also not interested. Very little private investment, especially by MSMEs. Some large cronies are big out there investing because they have the money, because they have access to government contracts, and because they can enter frontier areas with a medium-term vision. But other than that, we are not seeing a revival of investment. So which is the only agency that can provide some recovery? It's the government. The government has to spend more. That's the only way you will get a recovery. And yet we find that it spent less in 2021, and it spent hardly anything more in the first half of the current fiscal year. To me, these are terrifying numbers.
When the budget is approaching now, will you say the same thing, that the two numbers to be looked at, public expenditure in the current financial year and the next financial year?
I would add one number. I would say how much is being spent on the sectors that will generate mass demand.
Okay. And which are they?
Food, rural employment, ideally and urban employment, health, education. So I would say look at these 5 sectors and see how much is being spent there, because that's where we will get a clue as to whether mass demand will improve or not.
And Mrs. Ghosh, you have been also raising the issue of gender gaps in wages. So in this regard, what can budget do? Should it restore the different income tax slabs for women and men?
You know, such a small proportion of the Indian population pays income tax, and such a small proportion of women pay income tax, that I don't think you can really affect gender gaps in the economy through tax laws. And in fact, the budget can do things really in terms of spending. The patterns of spending, whether it's doing things in rural infrastructure and amenities that will reduce the unpaid work time of women, whether it is generating demand in MSMEs that will allow them to employ more women, whether it's doing that kind of indirect thing. Fiddling around with, the kind of nonsense that goes on in a lot of budget speeches. I'm removing the excise duty on bindis and things like that. All of that, frankly, is really not relevant.
A former chief economic advisor, Kaushik Basu, recently said that Indian economy risks stagflation. Do you concur with his views?
It's not a question of a risk, it's happening. It's an economy that is declining in real terms and prices are going up.
No, but
we are experiencing it.
Has it reached the stage of stagflation?
Well, we are certainly experiencing declining, we can't say declining growth rates because we had a major slump, but a slow, stagnant economy with rising prices, with falling employment, rising prices. If you like, the essence of stagflation is falling employment, rising prices. And that we are experiencing, right? There's no debate that we got falling employment and we have rising prices.
Mrs. Ghosh, you have also been criticizing privatization policies of the government. So do you oppose strategic disinvestment or even sale of minority stake by the government in PSUs?
This is clearly a case-by-case kind of thing, right? Definitely, strategic disinvestment in strategic sectors is a bad idea. Okay. Definitely, there are certain parts of the economy that must be retained in the public sector. I would put finance as a critical area. Banking and finance, I believe, is critical in that. But a whole range of public utilities, which have now been privatized, which really should be in the public domain, a whole range of public service provision, where we know that there's asymmetric information, conflicts of interest, health, education. These are all sectors where we know that the markets are very imperfect and people will get exploited by private markets. So public provision is absolutely essential. We also know that these are very large merit goods. That is, they provide social returns that go well beyond private returns. So private sector would underinvest in those. In all of these areas, it's very critical to have a large, buoyant, active public sector. In a range of other things, say hotels, I don't think it's necessary to have the public sector necessarily in hotels. But there are so many other aspects of public sector involvement which have far-reaching implications for the strategic nature of the economy, for the future development potential of the economy, and for an equitable and just economy, where we definitely need to have public control. Unfortunately, these considerations don't seem to enter when you're privatizing. You go for the profitable enterprises, you run them down, and then you sell them off at bargain basement prices to cronies. That, I think, is not just harmful today for the exchequer. It has terrible implications for the economy for the future.
In this regard, how do you see a public sector enterprise policy of the government, which says that these will be divided into strategic sectors and non-strategic sectors, and the government will withdraw from non-strategic sectors, but public sector enterprises will remain in strategic sectors? At least four of them.
It's really a question of defining the strategic properly and including in it all of the things that I've just mentioned. If you are going to focus only on defense, which, by the way, also this government is privatizing like anything, then I'm dubious. Let me be quite honest and say that I would not put as much emphasis on what the government says as I would on what it does. And what it has done so far is not very promising.
So you said education, health services, which should be in
basic amenities. I believe electricity. I believe basic infrastructure, water supply, all of the basic amenities and utilities. These used to be called natural monopolies for a reason. And the more you allow this into private domain, not only do you encourage exclusion on the basis of price and income, but you also enable all kinds of other imperfections to creep into markets and into the functioning of these sectors.
But government monopoly in the power sector, say, for example, all state electricity boards and all have been in a mess. That is why government had to unbundle power sector. What will you have to say on this?
You know, unbundling is a very different thing from giving it over to private enterprise. I have always found it odd that the issue of management is separated from the issue of ownership, or rather that the two are integrated, that you cannot have a professional management if you have public ownership. Far too often what has happened in a lot of public enterprises, including in power generation and distribution, is that they have become extremely politicized and there's been no accountability. So I definitely believe that public sector enterprises must be accountable. They must be transparent, accountable, reveal all of the activities and be open to public audit. That has not been the case. But just simply selling them off to the private sector doesn't do any of those things. It doesn't make them more transparent or accountable or open to public audit. And if anything, you're then just at the mercy of a local monopoly provider and you can do nothing about it. So I think it's important to separate the issue of ownership from the issue of management. We have many examples across the world of management in public sector companies being extremely professional and efficient. And we have many examples across the world and in India of management in private companies being absolutely disastrous. So I don't think it's the issue is that of ownership.
My last question to you is that since you are opposing unbridled privatization, how do you see India's economy post economic reforms and liberalization in 1991? Prior to that, economic policies have delivered the Hindu rate of growth. After that, at least economic growth has increased quite a lot.
There is this, it's extraordinary, the narrative that has sort of taken over, and it's in the school textbooks onwards, that there was all darkness and nothing happened in India till liberalization, and then suddenly there was this light, and there were markets, and everything was wonderful thereafter. It's a similar narrative to the one that is being peddled today about how nothing happened in India for 70 years and now suddenly things are happening, both of which unfortunately are completely false. So the Indian record of development until 1991 was extremely mixed. There were major failures in terms of feeding the population, educating the population, ensuring a healthy population, ensuring more equitable spread, ensuring employment generation. All of these were major failures of the pre-liberalization regime. What are the major failures of the post-liberalization regime? Feeding the hungry, educating the population, ensuring a healthy population, ensuring employment generation. Isn't it a bit weird that that's the same problems pre and post liberalization? How come those fundamentals which affect the quality of life of Indian citizens haven't changed? What we've got is a higher rate of growth. My Bengali grandmother would have said, am I going to eat that higher rate of growth? So I really think we have to stop obsessing with a GDP number, especially when we know that GDP reflects all kinds of things which are actually social bads, doesn't include a lot of things that are social goods, and in any case is extremely unequally distributed. Yes, we have had a lot more dynamism in certain sectors, but let's also admit that dynamism was built on things that were created during the Nehruvian period, whether it is the skilled labor coming out of the IITs, or it is the ability of a semi-diversified economy to create a reasonably diversified manufacturing export base. These are things that happened because of a particular economic strategy before. And to say that it was liberalization that unleashed them all is ridiculous.
But we will be back to the same debate between Amartya Sen and Arvind Panagaria over which should come first, growth or redistribution.
I don't think that that's the right way of putting it. I don't think that the two have to be sequential. If you look at the real success stories of the world, let's say the Scandinavian countries, it was not sequential at all. In fact, redistribution, social policy, active state intervention to ensure basic needs happened well before these were either high-income countries or rapidly growing economies. So this whole idea that you have to first do one, and then when you're rich, then you can start educating people and feeding them and all, that's nonsense. And that's not historically validated by any experience, including the East Asian experience.
Thanks a lot, Mrs. Ghosh, for talking to us. Thanks.
Thank you.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.